And we probably don't want to start. Let us know, John, how many people are still coming on so we know when to start.
Okay, it seems like we're sort of, we have about 52 people here right now.
Great.
Still coming in, but yeah.
Welcome, everybody. We're waiting to give people a chance to all show up. Where do you think you guys want to get started?
Yeah, it looks like the numbers have stabilized, so I think we should definitely get going.
Okay, Amy, are you doing the intro?
I think you are.
Okay, good. Just making
We are both welcoming you from Central West County.
on behalf of, I'll do
Go
it.
ahead.
Let's
Good.
go.
Elizabeth, I think you should start because Amy's is definitely breaking up.
Okay, happy to do it. Are we ready? Okay, so welcome everyone to Beyond Defensible Space. Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Lawson from Fire Safe Occidental and Safer West County. Safer West County is hosting this event because we're a 501c3 dedicated to reducing wildfire risk in Western Sonoma County and building resilience. We're excited to have this webinar about managing vegetation beyond the 100-foot zone, as many of us have to deal with that in our areas. This presentation is in conjunction with the Sonoma Ecology Center and Fire Safe Sonoma. And if you'd like to get involved in your local Fire Safe Council, we'll include a link in our post-event email. With that, I'd like to introduce Mason Innumerable, a California Grizzly Corps Fellow with Fire Safe Sonoma, and Ellie Inslee with Sonoma Ecology Center.
Yeah, great. And thank you, Elizabeth and Amy and Mason, for making this possible. And thank you everyone for joining us. I think we have a really great turnout. This is Beyond Defensible Space, Vegetation Management Outside the 100-foot zone. And it's I'm Ellie Inslee. I'm a landscape architect, and I've spent my career doing natural habitat restoration. I'm on the board of the Sonoma Ecology Center and co-founder of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. And I live in West County, actually in Grayton, and I'm enjoying getting to know everyone at Safer West County and Fire Safe Occidental. And I'm really, really pleased to have Brock Dahlman from Occidental Arts and Ecology and Mike Jones from UC Cooperative Extension giving this presentation today. A word about the Sonoma Ecology Center. Our mission is to work with our community to identify and lead actions that achieve and sustain ecological health in Sonoma. We operate through community-supported research, restoration, education, and partnerships. And this is a really great example of combining ecology, partnership, education, and community-supported work. So we couldn't do this without Fire Safe Sonoma. In particular, Roberta McIntyre, who recognizes the importance of this topic and who is providing funding to the Sonoma Ecology Center to put on this webinar. And so thank you so much, Roberta and Mason at Fire Safe Sonoma. And this has happened before. I try to advance the slide when I'm in webinar format. So give me a second. There we go. So this is a webinar. You all won't have audio or video activated, and we are recording the webinar. So if you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer box. And we will have some time afterwards. We'll try to answer some of the questions before. And I forgot to mention John Kanegi, who's also with Sonoma Ecology Center. He's on the panel. And John, I think you'll be kind of curating the Q&A. Let me know if you're not, text me or something if we forgot to mention that. So this presentation is inspired by the Resilient Landscapes Coalition presentation that we did on Defensible Space a month ago. And the Resilient Landscapes Coalition is the Habitat Corridor Project, Sonoma Ecology Center, UC Master Gardeners of Sonoma County, and Fire Safe Sonoma. And we do a lot of education around defensible space, habitat-friendly, biodiverse, defensible space. And everyone in Safer West County was very interested in what they could do beyond the 100 foot. So that's how this presentation came about. So I call this Beyond Defensible Space, Reducing Wildfire Risk While Tending the Land for Wildlife and Natural Resources. And West County in particular is devoted to this idea and specifically asked for the content, asking ourselves, how do we protect human lives and property while paying attention to others who are living here? What can we do to support and increase habitat and natural resources? So I'm going to be just doing a quick 10-minute introduction with some points about ecological principles. And after that, Mike Jones will cover wildfire and vegetation management in forest lands. And Mike specializes in forest pest management and forest health. Before joining UC Cooperative Extension in 2018, he earned a PhD in entomology from the State University of New York. And after Mike, Brock Dahlman will be talking about mending the wild, regenerative land management. And Brock is a wildlife biologist, restoration ecologist, and innovator in watershed management and permaculture design. And he co-founded Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, where he's lived for over 20 years tending the land. And after those two speak, we'll have 20 minutes of question and conversation. And that's often the richest part of these presentations, where we really get to hear from you all. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. I want to make a quick plug and a quick word about the Sonoma County Community Wildfire Protection Plan update. That's the CWPP update. And a quote from their website: the CWPP will contain hazard and risk analyses, and using a collaborative model will suggest projects that can efficiently reduce risk of loss of life, property loss, and environmental damage. And basically, to translate that, the county is gathering information from all of these groups, the fire safe councils and the Safer West County people, to find out what projects each community is promoting and prioritizing. And Caroleon Safford is leading this process, and there's her email there, and it will be in the resources. But one of the goals of the Sonoma Ecology Center is to ensure that ecological principles and practices are included in policy and in evaluating and prioritizing projects for grant funding. So it's this type of information we're providing today is really important for everyone to listen to and understand for a multitude of reasons. But getting some of these ideas into the CWPP update is going to be really important. So we have to start with this idea of working at from the house. And this is, I'm channeling Caroleon Safford here. To reduce wildfire risk as homeowners, the first thing we want to do with our limited resources of time and money is to protect human life and property. It's important to base our decisions on science where possible, and science is showing that the way to protect life and property is first harden your homes, harden the buildings, making sure that roofing, fencing, and deck materials are as impervious to fire and vents are impervious to embers as much as possible. So start at the building and then establish defensible space, first around the building and then out 5 to 30 and then 30 to 100 along entry and evacuation routes. Those are the things that are the most important for protecting human life and property. And then finally, we get to the topic at hand, moving to the area beyond defensible space. And I want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem services that our well-managed landscapes can provide. And it's really up to us as homeowners and landowners to take care of the land so that it is resilient to fire and reducing the risk of crown fires. There's plenty of shade in the forests that cools and retains moisture, cools the landscape, and also suppresses weeds. And our landscapes can enrich the soil and hold it in place, the things that we do on it. We want to clean and manage the water, and Brock Dahlman is the one who coined the phrase, slow it, spread it, sink it, store it. And our landscapes can sequester carbon if we manage them well and support biodiversity both above and below ground. So I couldn't do this presentation without showing this slide, which illustrates the issue of biodiversity loss. And we've all read in the news about the significant loss of insect biodiversity, as much as 75 to 80% in some areas over the last 20 to 30 years. And many other species are in decline. Studies have shown that loss of habitat is a primary driver, along with pesticide use and climate change. And we can make a difference on our properties as we tend our landscapes. Brock and Mike will go into more detail, but the point is we don't want to exacerbate the problem. You know, while we're concerned about fire, we don't want to go and clean up our landscapes, because in doing that, we're going to reduce complexity and habitat. So we want to be careful. Thinking about biodiversity and landscape complexity, we are looking at plant communities. And so when we go out beyond the 100 feet, there aren't just forests, but many of us have chaparral in the upper right. And that's a tremendous biodiversity resource. And there are lots and lots of birds and other species that reproduce in chaparral habitats. It has a really bad reputation as a fire-dependent plant community, but it's a really great nursery for animal species and has very unique qualities. So it's important to get to seek expert advice when you're working, not just in chaparral, but all different plant communities. The picture on the lower right is actually my oak woodland right in my property in Grayton. And I specifically took this picture in this location because there's a big old branch that fell down, and I'm going to leave it there for a while. I'll probably move it outside of the canopy, but it's really providing a great refuge for birds and other species who are dodging sharp-shinned hawks. And in a second, my cat's going to want to get up. But and then the left picture is what we think of when we think of forests. It's the redwood, Douglas fir, mixed evergreen plant community. But I actually learned from Mike Jones a few days ago that a forest actually just needs 1 tree per acre. to be considered a forest. So if you're looking for funding from EQIP, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, all you need is 1 tree per acre, and you'd be eligible for some of the forestry grant programs. And then just a slide to talk about protecting soil, streams, and fish, and reducing flammable invasive species. This picture is showing soil devoid of vegetation, which causes erosion, eliminates wildlife habitat, and is just asking for invasive fire-prone species of different species of broom, French broom, Scotch broom, as you see in the picture in the left, which I've kind of inserted. These broom species and non-native annual grasses are very fire prone. So we definitely want to tend our landscapes to reduce the incidence of these invasive species, but also when we go into do the vegetation management, that's the first thing we want to remove is those invasive species. So it's okay, and it's actually important when we're beyond the defensible space to have some messiness in the landscapes. A messy landscape can be compatible with managing wildfire risk if it's done correctly, and I'll leave that to Mike and Brock to talk about. But if you remember, we're outside of the defensible space zone, so it's okay to have things like clumps of shrubs that really do provide refuge for birds and downed logs and snags. All of these features in the landscape provide critical niches and habitat for birds, amphibians, reptiles, insects, fungi, and many other species. And then my last slide, this is a kind of an inspirational document that, thanks to Stuart Mitchell, came across my desk, Wildfire-Friendly Fuels Reduction in Dry Forests of the Pacific Northwest. And even though that's not, that's not our landscape, we at SEC are looking for funding to adapt this document to our Sonoma County plant communities. That it's wonderful because it emphasizes different ways to create habitat complexity within a fire resilient landscape. So while you're waiting for the Sonoma Ecology Center to create a local version, you can go on the website woodlandfishandwildlife.com, and they have many, many different examples of documents that talk about birds and many other species and how they use the landscape. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike, and thank you all very much. And you're on, Mike Jones.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here and letting me present. All right. As I was introduced, my name is Michael Jones. I am the Extension Forester for UC Cooperative Extension, Mendocino Lake and Sonoma Counties. And my background is forest health, integrated pest management. So I come at this from a different perspective when I think about forests than I think maybe people typically think. So for tonight's presentation, we're really coming at this kind of thinking about wildfire and wildfire risk and fuels management and safety in communities. But the way I approach this conversation and discussions with landowners about forest management is that the overarching long-term goal is to create healthy forest conditions that are sustainable and resilient to disturbance. And so what's really kind of neat about that is that means a lot of different things to folks, and how you achieve that totally depends on your short and long-term goals and objectives. So I think that's a really important aspect of thinking about forest management and managing vegetation for wildfire risk, is that there's no one right answer, and how you approach this depends entirely on how you want to do it. So for tonight, what I'll be talking about is just a real basic overview of fire and forest ecology. I think by this point, a lot of us are familiar with this kind of information, but it's very important to set the context for why we are, why I am and why my colleagues and why the scientific community promotes this idea of forest landscape management. We'll talk about forest health, wildfire resiliency, how we manage vegetation, or in the kind of framing tonight's conversation, we'll call it fuels, and then some of the resources that the group have been compiling as well as the information that I have posted on my website, the UCCE Mendocino website. So I think this is, right, we know this now, we live in a fire adapted ecosystem, right? You look at the numbers and in California, and something like, significant number, 80% plus more of the species, native species, are fire adapted. Something about 50% of those require fire for some part of their life cycle or to complete their life cycle. Fire has been a common disturbance. We're in a Mediterranean climate, dry summers, lightning strikes, all that good stuff. Native Americans, now that with that new awesome discovery and the white sands in Mexico, right? Native Americans have been managing this land for some 20,000 years or so, probably. And they have, taken what is a naturally occurring fire return interval and shortened it in many cases to manage the land for their needs and to steward the land. So fire is a common disturbance. And some really great research that came out from my colleagues, Scott Stevens at Berkeley a few years ago. He kind of reconstructed fire return intervals, or the length of time between natural and ignited fire occurrences, at least that were significant enough to leave a fire scar, some kind of evidence. And this is a busy slide, but what I've highlighted in the red here is, I think, what are the important habitats that we're thinking about are redwood systems and oak woodlands. And you see that fire return interval in redwoods was 10 to 30 years on the long, and in California oak woodlands it was 3 to 8 years. So that's pretty frequent burning occurring in these habitats that has shaped the flora and fauna, right? This frequent fire is a huge disturbance that has influenced how and what flora and fauna can occur in these sites, how they've evolved, how they've adapted to live with this fire. And so with European kind of colonization and settlement of the West Coast, we started to see, significant impact to these natural and important disturbance cycles. And primarily the biggest one was the exclusion of fire. Not only was Native American burning kind of outlawed and taken away from them as a cultural practice, but we set about a policy from a land management perspective of removing all fire. And especially after we had, for example, the big fires in the upper west in Idaho and Montana, with the big blowups in the 1910 with Pulaski and the Forest Service creation and Pinchot and all those great folks that, all those old dead white guys that we kind of talk about these days. We really set around to having this 10 a.m. policy of putting out fire. And what we see happen from that is basically this huge accumulation of biomass. So when you remove disturbance that is managing the biomass and the habitat, and you take out and kind of control any kind of disturbance, we'll talk about other types, right? But fire is really important for these systems. You have this huge accumulation of biomass. So this is a pretty famous set of photos from up in the Plumas National Forest. But it happens here too. So this is Mendocino County in the Boonville area, Cow Mountain, and there's lots of Cow Mountains, so that doesn't mean much. But anyway, the point is that this is similar habitat to West County. And even here we see, this significant increase in vegetation, where we have in the 50s more open grasslands, and then more recently this year, when I kind of pulled this data, you see, almost a 50% encroachment of oak woodland and conifer and other hardwood encroachment into those rangelands. And so we're seeing this accumulation of biomass across all habitat types in our area. And what that does, it does a lot of things, but one of the big ones is, right, we've significantly influenced and degraded the resiliency of these habitats to wildfire, right? So we've removed this really important disturbance, and now when fires do occur, because it's not, we can exclude it for so long, but obviously we can't do it forever. And that's where we find ourselves right now in this kind of suppression model. And when these forests and habitats do burn, we see pretty significant fire effects. And so we've significantly impacted the resiliency of these habitats to wildfire. And also, that just removal of disturbance means that we've affected other forest health aspects. So this is a very important topic that a lot of us are concerned about, and particularly if we're interested in managing and maintaining oak woodlands, the encroachment of conifers and other hardwoods, and Doug fir in particular, into these oak woodlands is a pretty significant forest health issue, and a pretty challenging thing to manage with, not only from a fire perspective, right, because all that additional fuel in the understory and in the midstory, but because of the impact on the oaks and the limited regeneration that we're experiencing in our oak woodlands, and the competition for limited resources under drought, lots of things that we could go into a long, depressing conversation about. But the point is that it's not just about wildfire. We were impacting the health of these systems through other mechanisms. It's also really important for me to point out that the encroachment of conifers and oak woodlands is not a bad thing unless you're really worried about oak woodland conservation and management. This is a normal process of succession. This is natural that occurs in the absence of disturbance. So we've created these conditions that have allowed this like successional transformation in these forests. And so this isn't a bad thing. So your management goals are to create more diversity and have a mix of oak woodlands with conifer habitat, then maybe you're not so worried about this. But if you're worried about your black oaks and your Oregon white oaks, then maybe you are worried about that encroachment. But along with that encroachment comes mortality. And so we're seeing Doug fir mortality in other types of conifer mortality in areas that maybe we wouldn't have experienced before, right? Competition and drought, it's all tied together. And when we have accumulation of biomass, particularly in high elevation ponderous pine forests or areas where we have a more homogeneous or a dominant species, we get significant insect activity. And so as we experienced a few years ago, we have these incredible bark beetle outbreaks that resulted in the mortality of millions and millions of trees over thousands and thousands of acres. And so these are all factors that it's a very complex story, but through the removal of fire and natural disturbance regimes, we've kind of created the ideal conditions for a lot of these events to take place. And as you all are familiar with, this is a much more tricky issue, but sudden oak death, right? Sudden oak death is a very hard invasive disease to manage, but through forest stewardship and forest management, we can certainly work to slow the spread and mitigate the impact and hopefully build in resilience. And while we'll ultimately see, I think, a functional extinction of tan oak in a lot of areas, if we can manage the residual tan oak that survives and help them regenerate, then we can eventually return it to the landscape in some capacity. So that's kind of my general spiel about forest health and the role of wildfire. And so now let's talk about fire behavior and vegetation or fuels. And right, so we have all this biomass accumulation. And basically, if you look at it kind of a cross section, what you see is that it's basically continuity of fuel. So you have a lot of surface fuels that helps carry ground fire. You have ladder fuels that carries that ground fire up into the canopy or the crown of the tree. And then you ultimately lead to these crown fires that are high severity, high intensity, hard to control. And these are the kinds of fires that lead to stand replacement events. And so we see these in our conifer forests and Doug fir dominated areas, and I'll show some photos, but we're starting to see these kinds of fires occurring in redwoods as well. And this is exactly what I was talking about. These are from the 2020 LNU fires. On the left is a photo from the Wallbridge fire. On the right is a photo from the Myers fire, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. That's the ocean. And this was a significant, we call it stand replacement. Redwood is kind of funky. It's like, I love redwood. They're spectacular trees, but they're basically weeds, right? They're really good at resprouting and reproducing. And so it's still quite, what do I say? It's still quite kind of surprising and incredible to see stand replacement fire where you have that top killer, or what we call above ground biomass mortality in redwood stand, especially overlooking the ocean. And this is really because of that accumulation of biomass, as well as, as I said, it's complex. Changes in the land use, historical changes in the land use, historical land management practices that have kind of set us up for these conditions, climate change, drought, all these, it's a laundry list of things that we've done to kind of mess up these systems that are contributing. But really, biomass is a huge factor. And so, right, I kind of gave it away there, but of the 20 largest California wildfires in recorded history, something like 10 of them have occurred in the last 5 years. The ones in red are the ones just from this year alone. And when we think about these fires, what is that we can do? How can we control it? And we think about the fire triangle, which is this combination of what are the fuels or the vegetation conditions, what's the topography, and what's the weather. We know these are all huge factors. And what's realistically the easiest thing to manage here? We certainly can talk about weather, our influence on weather with climate change, but that's a larger conversation, a much more difficult topic to address rather quickly. You can't deal with topography, but what can we do? We can manage the fuels or the vegetation. And we know it works. So this is the goat fire from, oh, I already forgot. I think it's Lassen or Shasta. In 2000, you see the little orange circled area. That was an area that had been thinned while the stand around it had not been thinned. And we see a lot of that stand replacement mortality or stand replacement fire with tree mortality. Here's another example, the Negro fire in 1999. We see thin treated area where the densities have been thinned and the fuels have been reduced, and we see the fire staying on the ground, whereas untreated areas it pops up in the canopy. And by all evidence, the Caldoor fire, which was on just a tear up to South Lake Tahoe, from everything that I've seen and talked with folks about, it's really the areas where they had done fuels treatments and done thinning and other types of projects that we'll talk about in a minute, is what gave fire suppression firefighters the opportunity to direct attack or to change the fire behavior enough that they could get a handle on it and keep it from running into town. So there's lots of evidence that suggests and indicates, and the data is also really strong here, that managing vegetation is a crucial part of thinking about wildfire risk and forest health. So what do we mean from thinning? So I've been using this term thinning. So it can mean a lot of things, and it certainly will mean something different to everyone. And as I mentioned before, how you thin or what you thin depends on your goals and objectives. But basically, the idea that we're kind of trying to communicate and work with here is the idea is remove fuel continuity and the amount of biomass on the landscape. So one thing we're trying to do is keep the fire out of the crown. So we're going to remove ladder fuels, the fuels that are the intermediate fuels that carry fire from the surface into the crown or the canopy of trees. We're going to increase spacing between trees. We want horizontal, but also vertical spacing. So the idea of thinning out densities, but removing ladder fuels. We're reducing that continuity, like I said. And then, ultimately, what I think everybody is really interested in is creating conditions in which we have fewer small trees and more big trees, because we all recognize that the bigger trees, that all of our native species have some kind of fire adaptive life history strategy. And we know that the bigger trees are much more resilient in most cases to wildfire. And so we want fewer, bigger trees. And, when we talk about this huge accumulation of biomass, I think it's really important to point out that, these aren't all giant trees, right? We have these dense stands, and I'll show some photos of, you have lots of small trees. And so thinning out those small trees to help trees grow better, to reduce competition, spacing is all really key aspects of why we thin. So here's an example. Here's how that kind of plays out. This is, again, high elevation, dry ponderosa pine forest, but you see we have an impenetrable wall of a lot of that's regeneration, but you thin it out. You're not creating just like a park-like structure, but you certainly are opening up the stand and changing the distribution and continuity of that fuel. So here's graphically that same figure again, where we have managed fuels. We've thinned the trees out. We removed many of the ladder fuels. We've thinned the surface fuels, or the fuels on the vegetation, the understory. And the intent is to keep the fire on the ground, to influence fire behavior, right? The goal is to try to keep the fire on the ground. Optimally, it's almost like you try to create conditions with the fire is very easy to do a direct attack on, suppress it directly, or maybe even under right conditions, it'll kind of just creep along as a ground fire and put itself out eventually, or have a lot lower severity or intensity as it does burn. And so how do we, here's implementation. How do we actually, what does that look like, and how do we achieve those? So we'll talk, this is again with the thread of thinning, and we're just going to talk about the different, not the, what thinning is, but the different types of thinnings that we can do. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but this is kind of a lot of the common things that I work with landowners on and my colleagues. So as we've been talking about, fuels reduction is priority, right? We really want to reduce fuels and manage fire risk in high priority areas, structural within our ingress egress around structure, and in high priority areas on the landscape that we want to protect or that we want to influence fire behavior before it gets to our wildland urban face or our community or our home. So fuels reduction is basically the idea of thinning small, suppressed, and weak trees. So you can see on the left side of the photo, that's the before, the unthinned. On the right, that's the thinned This was masticated. So you can see that all the material was chipped up. And a lot of that's dug fir. So that's all conifer regeneration that has occurred in the absence of fire. We can use strategic thinning to create strategic kind of defensible space areas on the landscape. So a really popular one right now is shaded fuel breaks. And we like to do those on ridges and roads. And so, you know, a lot of the work you see Fire Safe Council is doing, Cal Fire doing right now is the understory thinning to reduce fuels along roads, to open up the space for, you know, fire equipment and fire suppression. I think it's really important, and this is such a great photo on the left. You see that here's a shaded fuel break kind of, I don't know, kind of implemented on a ridge, but you see that on both sides is stand replacement fire. And I think this is really important, is the point of a shaded fuel break is not to stop the fire. It's not going to. The idea is to change the fire behavior. And so what you see is you have crown fire racing up that slope. It hits the shaded fuel break. The fire drops to the surface. It creeps along as a surface fire. And then when it pops out of that shaded fuel break and hits that dense vegetation, it goes back up on the crown. And so the idea is that by having these shaded fuel breaks, you give firefighters places to do direct attack or some kind of back burning or some kind of fire suppression activity. And ideally, you're combining with other types of forest management that when you do have a shaded fuel break with thinning or other types of management practices, the fire does stay on the ground and maybe even goes out in some cases, which I have seen and I will show you photos of, or maybe you give more opportunity for suppression. So shaded fuel breaks are pretty awesome. And I definitely am much more in favor of those as opposed to fire breaks, which is that kind of idea of clearing all the vegetation down to the soil. And then this is a big one, right? We're thinning for oak woodland health. And I talked about this before. We're removing conifer, hardwood encroachment, and we are reducing the fuel loading and ultimately trying to restore the ecological sustainability of these systems, the health, and implement some kind of disturbance regime that helps maintain these oak woodlands, right? Always in almost every situation, the conifers are going to outcompete the hardwoods. And so thinning is a really crucial tool to kind of maintain oak woodland health. And then we're thinning, as I mentioned, for forest health, right? I talked about a lot about some of the forest health issues that we're experiencing. That was certainly not a long list. I could go on all day just about bugs and insects or bugs and diseases. But the short end is the idea is that we're trying to improve forest health, create more sustainable and resilient forest structure. It's resiliency to disturbance, wildfire, pests and diseases, any kind of abiotic or biotic disturbance factor you can think of, right? We want to try to improve the stand's resiliency to those disturbance events. And so this is two really cool examples. On the bottom is thinning in old growth, I believe that's ponderosa pine. And on the right is thinning in old growth redwood. And the idea here, this is say the redwoods on their property. The idea is that they're reducing the amount of competition in these old growth stands because we've removed the natural type of disturbance, which is fire, which would maintain that structure, to improve the vigor by reducing competition and freeing up more nutrients and releasing the trees and giving them more light. We're improving the health of the trees so they grow, they continue to grow, and then they're more resilient and healthy to disturbances that occur. So this is, I think, a pretty cool idea that, a little bit of thinning, these light thins can really go a long way to help improve the overall condition of the stand. So again, not an exhaustive list, but some of the big things that I see folks really interested in. So how do we thin? What are the tools that we use? And again, this is just kind of a couple examples. I'm sure everybody has their own ideas and has done different kinds of practices. So kind of a newer tool that's coming around that's pretty awesome in my opinion is going to help us really increase the amount of management in the area that we can work is this idea of mastication. And basically it's lots of different forms of equipment that can masticate. You can have brush hogs, or you can have skid steers with brush mowers on it, or in these cases, these are excavators with like kind of flailing drums on them, and they can kind of chew up trees and vegetation and mulch it down to chips. It's pretty cool to see. And the effects are pretty great. You can really reduce that fuel loading and manage those fuels. There's the good old hand thinning, which is what we all do. And the common practice, and it's just somebody with a chainsaw or a handsaw out in the woods cutting trees down and piling up, and we'll talk about different ways of managing it, but piling them and burning them or spreading them out. You have commercial thinning, and I know that this isn't necessarily always a very popular option, and I'm not saying that everyone needs to go out and turn their forests into commercial timberland, but I think this is right. I'm trying to provide you all the tools that are available to you to kind of achieve this management work, and I think this is a really important option to keep on the table. And the reason I say that is because with a light thinning, you can generate a lot of revenue that maybe you don't need to have money in hand at the end of the day. But with light thinning, you can then have in the contract a lot of the work we've been talking about conducted in your sites. And so I think it's a really awesome mechanism to achieve this work, because I haven't mentioned it at all, and we haven't talked about it at all, is the expense of this work. It's very expensive to do this kind of thinning work. And if you have an option that creates a sustainable, viable market and it can help improve the health and sustainability of your forests, I think that's something that is a really powerful tool in helping you achieve long-term goals and objectives here. So again, it's not something that I think is a high priority, but certainly something I don't want people to just strike off the table right away, because I think it can be an important option. Everybody's favorite right now is grazing. Grazing is just great. Everybody loves to have their goats and sheep or cows or whatever they want, but grazing is a really cool way and a fun way. Again, done sustainably and with knowledgeable folks to help manage the fuels in your forested land, on your natural resources. A really important thing to point out here is, we have all this biomass, and basically by thinning, all we've done is just change the distribution or the structure of that biomass, right? For the most part, I haven't even talked about removing it from the site. So managing slash is really important. Right, so we can pile and burn, which is pretty common with hand thinning, and so you actually just pile the material up and burn it. You can chip and mulch it. As you see, they have pretty sophisticated chippers now. They're tracked. They can walk into the stands. They can do all kinds of things. You can, and there's a little skid steer with a mulching head on it. You can remove it. So on the bottom right, you see what I think is a pretty extreme example of vegetation management, where they've created park-like structure along that road. Great defensible space, great shaded fuel break. And on the road, great, but I don't know if I would subscribe to that level of cleanliness. It seems a little bit excessive. And then there's lop and scatter on the top right, which is the idea of kind of just cutting up material and spreading it out. But you're leaving a lot of that biomass there, and that can be a potential issue. But I also want to point out right now that slash is really, we call it slash, but this is just the vegetation left over from thinning, or it could be the material left over when a tree falls on its own. But all of this biomass has a pretty important role in the forest, right? This is where all the nutrients are, that they'll be broken down through decomposition, recycled back into the system. The piles of slash provide habitat and refugia for animals and microorganisms, and to protect the soil. So I think, as I mentioned in that one that looks like a park, I think there's a role or a way to manage the amount of biomass and slash, but maybe in some situations we want to leave a little bit on the landscape. And I think one way to do that, and this is probably the most exciting tool we're working with right now in dealing with slash and the biomass accumulation and the health of our systems, is fire. So to reintroduce prescribed fire into these systems to not only manage the biomass that we've thinned, but to return these systems to a natural disturbance regime. And so prescribed fire, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and I imagine Brock will be talking about this because I know they were working with Fire Forward and Unburning, and they've done their own burns. Right, you use fire under predetermined conditions to achieve your specific goals and objectives, and it's just a really powerful tool to achieve a lot of different goals and objectives. It's just, I think it's incredible how quickly people have kind of are adopting this idea and reintroducing fire when they're ready, and it's pretty cool to see. And so I can't speak enough about how important I think fire is as a follow-up treatment and a long-term treatment for managing these systems, because it's important to remember, and I'll emphasize this again later, is that this is not one and done, right? This is maintenance. We are doing the first entry. It may require a lot of work, And each entry after that will require less and less, but we're not done. We're continuously managing this vegetation, these fuels. So this is an example of how prescribed fire and thinning combined work. This is a photo from the glass fire, which if y'all are familiar, is kind of that Napa-Sonoma border. On the left side of the photo is where the glass fire burned through. On the right side of the road is a prescribed burn unit that we had burned, I think, like 16 months before the fire came through. And, you know, basically, it's not, you don't need a lot of explanation here, but you can see the difference. And there was no suppression on site. This road was the only thing that separated these two kind of stands. And now we're inside the stand itself, and you see this was burned, so you can see the little bit of the charring on the base of those big Doug Fur. This is a landowner. He had been thinning, understory thinning by hand, and then we had burned the unit. And what you see is, just like I showed those aerial photos before, we had a stand of conifers that were green. It was an island of green. I wish I had an aerial photography of this photo of this. An island of green surrounded by, you know, some high severity wildfire. So this is thinning combined with prescribed fire, and it's just a pretty incredible kind of effect here in my mind of how that plays out under wildfire conditions. So to conclude, right, fire is an important essential disturbance in our ecosystem. I didn't say a lot about this throughout the talk, but one way to start thinking about how you're going to manage this vegetation and your long-term goals and objectives and what tools you're going to use is to develop a plan. And so we have this California Cooperative Forest Management Plan. It's a very basic plan that you know, you could look over yourself without much professional help and start to really develop some goals and objectives and ideas about how you want to proceed. And if you decide to pursue cost share funding or get more serious about managing your forest lands, then you can work with a professional, like a registered professional forester, to fully develop your plan and then pursue funding to achieve some of these goals and objectives of forest thinning. And I will say that to follow up on Ellie's statement earlier, in my opinion, if a tree occurs, it's forest land. So if you have a tree on your property, that's a forest in my opinion, right? We think about the urban forest. It certainly is different species and a different habitat than a closed canopy forest, but it's still forest land. But according to CAL FIRE rules, you have to have 10% canopy cover to be considered a forest land. And so that's important to remember when you're thinking about pursuing funding. You can develop a management plan for your entire property, which can include multiple habitat types, and really you can lay out your goals and objectives for each of those habitat types. But if you want to specifically address management in your forest land, there are certain definitions that you have to abide by. And remember, forest management is ongoing. It's crucial that you follow vegetation maintenance, because if you do this one and done, it's not going to be permanent. It's going to grow back, and that's kind of ideal. We want it to grow back because that means we have productive site, but that means that we're not ultimately reducing the fuel loading and creating more healthy, sustainable conditions. All right, so some resources, and like I said, the guide that they're putting together will have a lot more content, and then my website that I'll have at the very last slide has a lot of this laid out. But for technical resources, I highly recommend that the first step you take is to talk to a forester, a registered professional forester. The RCDs have a lot of capacity. I'm sure a lot of y'all know Jason Wells, who's the RCD forester of Sonoma County. He is awesome and doing a lot of really good work. And then the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Jeff Kelly, I think, covers all of Sonoma County. And so these two foresters are going to be really important folks that you're going to want to connect with if you're thinking more aggressively about managing your forest lands. And of course, myself, and within my capacity and within the UC Cooperative Extension Program, we have lots of resources to help you think about how you're going to manage your land, including what I think is a really brilliant 25-part series, Forest Stewardship series, which is little short pamphlets on different aspects of forest management. There's some financial programs. These are all cost shares. So we have the Environmental Quality Incentive Program from NRCS. We have California Forest Improvement Program from CAL FIRE. And then the RCDs with Rebuild North Bay have the North Bay Forest Improvement Program. All really great programs that will help you achieve a lot of your goals and objectives. There are requirements, and it can be tedious, and a lot of these programs are backlogged because of demand and capacity, but they are there, and hopefully we kind of make them more viable as we get more demand and interest in managing landscapes before fires. And if you're really interested in pursuing more about prescribed fire, you can contact me. Our fire advisor up in Humboldt County, Lenny Davidson, is really the one that kind of reintroduced this idea of these prescribed burn associations, which is this community level grassroots effort of neighbor helping neighbor put good fire on the ground. But if you have something much more complex and you would rather have CAL FIRE taken on, then they have their vegetation treatment or management program, which is, again, a great program that they work with private landowners to kind of put good fire and do some prescribed burning for field reduction on your land. So I hope I was in okay time. I'm sorry I wasn't paying enough attention, but thank you for your time. I appreciate it. This is my contact info. You can feel free to email me. Check out the resources on the website. I look forward to maybe time for Q&A later and hear what Brock has to say and maybe how we can kind of bounce off each other in that conversation. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. And there you go, Brock, you are on next.
Hey, thank you, Ellie. All righty, I'll go ahead and share my screen here with y'all. Get this going. That working for folks? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
Hi, everyone out there. Fun to be online with you. Thanks, Mike. That was a super great presentation and overview. And thanks to just Ellie and everyone at Sonoma Ecology Center and everybody at Safer West County and for hosting this. So yes, my name is Brock Dahlman, and I am a landowner in West County. I'm actually one of the landowners on the 80-acre property that is known as Sowing Circle on Coleman Valley Road, although most folks know it as the Oxnard Ecology Center, which is where I actually work. So I get to live and work at the same place. And many of you all in West County know where we are, and so I'm going to skip on to that. And I did just want to start off by acknowledging that we are also here, and for those of us who dwell in West County, are on the tribal homeland of the Kashaya Pomo, and also of the Southern Pomo and of the Coast Miwok, and they are the traditional folks who are still here. And we at OAC have the blessing of working a lot with them over the last several decades. And I just want to honor those people and our opportunity to strive to act as good guests on their land while we're here. And hopefully the work we're promoting here counts as being a good guest in restorative ways. And I think like a watershed a lot. I think like a fire shed. I think like I'm a topophiliac. And so starting off with the fact that from here in West County, being in the Russian River watershed, specifically in the Dutch Bill Creek watershed, and acknowledging Totem salmon with respect to the work we're going to be talking about tonight, or I am, as a case study of how we've been managing the land at our property at Sowing Circle and OAC, that really Totem coho salmon has been the organism that is keeping me honest, if you will. Am I creating, even though we don't have any, quote, formal salmon habitat with respect to breeding and rearing on the property at OAC. And just a map that maybe many of you all in West County have seen before, made by David Berman. Again, where are you in the system? I'm really interested in which watershed and what, because what fire shed is that? What vegetation community types is really distinct relative to where are you? And as Ellie stated, while critically, a lot of the focus is about protecting human life and human property, and that's really important. And we heard a lot about just the home hardening and the 5, the 30, the 100, and taking care of that. And tonight really is about, in addition to us as humans, it's just the more than non-human that we share this. And these are just some various life forms that I took photos of here on the property at OAC. And so in this idea of beyond defensible space and thinking about that, I'm often, as a designer, I'm interested in basically where are you? And so I talked a little bit about watersheds, but where's your property? Is it on a ridge? Is it in a valley? Is it creekside, riparian? Is it of a steep slope? Is it on north slope, south slope? Where are you is really important to think about with respect to fire behavior, watershed. And then Mike also mentioned this quite a bit. What are your goals as a landowner? And do you have goals for your fire goals? Do you have water goals, biodiversity goals, human health and safety goals, aesthetics? Ideally, I'm interested in all of those goals and finding an integrated way to optimize all of them. Critically, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, when we talk about vegetation management, what we're really talking about are ecosystem management. We're talking about habitat community types. And so forests is a broad idea. Woodlands, chaparral, grassland, riparian, wetland. There's so many types, say, of vegetation that are really habitat communities. And then also talking about the when are we? What's that land use history where you are? What is it? Was it historically logged in the 1800s? Was it logged in the 30s? Was it firewooded through the 50s? Did it get another logging post-World War II boom? Has it been not logged in a long time? What state of succession is it? Has it just been let go? Is it under the influence of significant fire suppression or grazing, overgrazing, or undergrazing? And then there's the question of, well, how do you do this work? And you know, the question before many of us is, do I cut it? Do I thin it? Do I burn it? As Mike showed, do I masticate it? Do you chip it? Do you biochar it? Do you mow it? Do you graze it? Do you leave it alone? Do you select a portfolio that has the appropriate recipe for a little bit of each of those based on your goals? And that's what I'm interested in. And I'm also interested in, we as, while we have private property rights, what I'm offering up here is we also have private property and public trust responsibilities. And as disturbers of processes, are we acting as degenerative disturbers, or are we engaging as regenerative disturbers? Are we engaging in systems that are regenerating the carrying capacity for life on this place, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the life cycle, in ways that are fire resilient and water resilient and life resilient? And clearly, a lot of the questions of who's doing all this labor and with what money, and are we also doing it in a way that creates a just workforce and working with leadership and education and training? And that's something we're very interested in, collaborative with as well. And the answer to all of these questions is it depends. And it really depends on you and your goals. And so I think this kind of fire is this wind-driven fire that we've all been tragically witness to, some more than others, throughout Northern California, Sonoma County, as of the last number of years, is what has certainly got a lot of folks woke to this reality check. And even though those of us who started the West County Fire Safe Council in 2003, I can tell you it was a hard sell back in 2003 to get people to want to form a fire safe council. And I'm super happy that that's not the case right now. But low frequency, high intensity fire is a modern construct because of a pyro-illiterate mismanagement of landscape. Inversely, and I think, thank you, Mike, for acknowledging indigenous fire and just natural fire periodicity, lightning fire, and the combination thereof. What does it look like to move towards high frequency and low intensity fire in different ways? And I'll mention a little bit of the prescribed burning that we have done at OAC for the last pushing 25 years now. And so towards the suggestion that Mike made about putting together a plan back in 2015 and 2016 with Forester Harold Appleton and Lindsay Daly and Jim Coleman and myself, we received some California Forest Improvement Program funds through CAL FIRE and with NRCS, and we created a stewardship plan. We called it a wildland stewardship plan, and we created a whole series of goals. So I'm not going to read all of those, but we have goals for our soils, we have goals for water, we have goals for fire, we have goals for life, we have education, we have economic goals. And all of them are really about resilient landscapes and engaging in a regenerative disturbance regime with the mosaic of the property we're on, which is really quite diverse, amazingly diverse. So 2 maps of the OAC 80 acres here on either side, mixed evergreen hardwoods. So that shading of color there shows the distribution of our oak, madrone, bay, coast live oak, white oak, some black oak in there. And then we also have significant coniferous forests that are predominantly Douglas fir and coast redwood, and bits of blends in there, certainly some tan oak and other things in there. And I, as a biologist, I'm an endangered species vertebrate biologist, first and foremost. I'm often looking for what's the totem species to me that is representative for these types of habitats for whom I'm managing. And if I can create a mixed evergreen hardwood forest that is fire safe and beautiful, that ultimately creates habitat for neotropical migrant birds, such as this western tanager there. Or maybe in my coniferous forest, the red tree vole, Arboremus pomo, Sonoma tree vole, that's an obligate herbivore that lives in Douglas fir trees, and OAC is the southeasternmost known distribution of that species functionally in North America. So I'm managing for a stand age class series with my Douglas fir, which means we're keeping the big trees on behalf of them. Or right now, if anybody's been paying attention, the madrones are going off right now with their berries, and the band-tailed pigeons and the cedar waxwings are just amazing out there. And so we're striving to manage for these wildlife indicators that tell us we're doing a good job with our, quote, vegetation management. How do we create conditions conducive for critters in a way that's not catastrophically creating a conflagration? We have coastal prairie at OAC, one of the great grassland ecosystems, and we also have soft chaparral, primarily coyote brush, poison oak, brambles, and things. Wren tit, for me, is my indicator species of soft chaparral. Quail are critical there, and so for me, coyote brush isn't just that scrub you should just burn, which I think a lot of people feel like it is. We're managing a mosaic, a differential mosaic of different vegetation communities with ecotones, the edges where they commingle in the mosaic, and stand age class diversity on behalf of not just the plants, but also the associated wildlife or the fungus in a complex mosaic. That ultimately is striving towards what I call mending the wild, which is really riffing on the title of a book called Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson, which I would highly recommend to anyone, about traditional Native American environmental land management in California. But we got a lot of mending to do. So we are going to put a link to this resource, which is an article I published in the California Native Plant Society journal called Fremontia back in 2016, that has more explanation around some of the types of land management practices we were doing at OAC on behalf of primarily coastal prairie and chaparral. We do prescribed burning here. We do a lot of mechanical hand thinning and limbing. We do some mowing at times. So we're optimizing our disturbance regimes. We do hand seed collection. We throw seed of natives in after burning or after mowing. And to be honest with you, our landscape at OAC, like many of us in West County and beyond, in a legacy post-logging regime over many iterations, we're minimum third growth here, and also modern fire suppression has left us with a landscape where at OAC, when we bought the land in '94, we're facing 30 plus acres of what looked like this. Significantly overstocked, Douglas fir encroaching. The fir don't just encroach hardwoods, they encroach the chaparral, they encroach the grassland. We have the similar map that Mike showed of a slow reduction in the diversity and complexity of this landscape due to the fire suppression of the last 50 years here and beyond, actually, where Douglas fir, which is an incredible tree, it's a native tree, again, it's critical habitat for so many species, but the young firs and the density of them is an indicator of a successionary state. Again, that may be a state you want. For my goals are really about fewer trees and more forest. We're a private property holder. We're a small landholder. This is a non-commercial operation. We're not making make a living on this. And so our vision is really a thinning program that is reducing the number of trees on behalf of increased forest health. So I can see the forest for the trees. And that forest to me is a verb, and trees might be more thought of as a noun. And we're low grading, we're feeding low on the carbon food chain. We're taking the small and the weak and the sickly ones, and we're leaving the biggest and best trees. We're striving to retain and maintain closed canopy primarily, and retain that canopy closure in many of our cases. And we'll talk a little bit about shaded fuel breaks. And we're disconnecting the ground fuel from the crown fuel by rearranging the fuel load architecture. So as you see in these photos moving from left to right, In the upper one, if you can see, actually, there's a little tent in the back, and it's the same photo taken, a day later. And we're engaging with it's a gardening process. We're engaging in a relationship with the land. And I just do want to put this up a little bit because I also co-direct the Water Institute. And so I think about fire a lot, but I think about water a lot. And there's some papers out there in this recent study by Matt O'Connor and Jeremy Cover, looking at this age of forest and these overstocked forests with lots of young trees rapidly growing, and the relationship to evapotranspiration and impacts of that evapotranspiration demand from shallow water in the shallow groundwater profile, possibly dewatering hill slope hydrology, which is reducing ultimately water available for in-stream flows for salmonid recovery. And so what does it look like to do limbing and thinning on behalf of enhancing the hydrologic cycle of a site and also improving the overall stand conditions so it's less flammable and doesn't all burn to the ground? When we get a normal fire, and all bets are off at times when there's a wind-driven fire per se, but we're still thinning because there's so many other benefits and goals to doing this work ecologically and hydrologically and biologically. So for us to get into a stand like this image where there's a limbing and a thinning, and these photos are not at OAC, by the way, but a project I was supporting some folks on, where there was Douglas fir encroaching into hardwoods and oaks. So on the upper left, we, with a group of folks, we limbed up many of those firs, and some of those firs we took out. We felled the trunks primarily on the contour, and then the green boughs and the pliable material we skidded down off the slope in this ginormous gully that you can see in the lower left that's been eroding away, calving off, dumping dirt into a salmon stream down below. And as gullies in size, they dewater the volume of hill slope hydrology and the amount of water that can be held in the hill slopes. So they're a desiccating agent as well as a water polluting entity, but through sediment delivery. And so we strategically are packing these gullies in a very intentional methodology, placing bough by bough by bough by bough in a linear or a layered, like a layer cake. That creates a microfibrous organic gauze bandage to staunch the bleeding of this gully wound that's happening. And then that material, that organic material, slowly composts in place. And as water delivers sediment particles and debris, it locks itself in and it becomes a carbon sequestration sponge. And so our mantra here is slash is not trash, it's beneficial biomass. And waste is not our in our vocabulary here. So there may be a whole suite of beneficial biomass reutilization portfolio. So again, as Mike said, that's incredible material. And it's the product of photosynthesis and all of this biological material. That's all carbon-based material. There may be times that you choose to burn it strategically in a burn to produce something called biochar, that you're going to harvest the biochar to utilize for soil improvement and soil health and such. And that's really cool. In some cases, we just pile the brush and don't burn it and strategically place it in ways to make a wildlife habitat pile, a place for the quail to hide in, or a place for a wood rat, the dusky-footed wood rat, to make a nest in. And I'll talk about them. There are times when we do burn piles because we need to move that biomass out. And so small burn piles when it's legal and it's in season and you've got your permits lined up. The lop and scatter is a treatment that Mike talked about where we may be limbing, thinning, and then laying material on the ground. Ideally, you're compressing it and cutting it and lopping it to below 18 inches on the ground and managing the density of it. To be honest with you, this photo is a little bit dense. It's not one, I realized I didn't have one from our lop and scatter here, came from the web. We also lop and lay on contour, and we may lop it and strategically place these as little contour bundles of carbon that we iteratively break up slope lengths on contour that slows water flow and intercepts leaf litter and creates little microhabitats and for carbon sequestration. I'm going to talk more about packing this brush like I just did into head cut gullies. There are definitely times when you need to chip it. You may chip it and haul it. You may chip it in situ. You may chip it and use it for compost. You may chip it for mulch. And then we also look a lot at our Douglas fir and honor those round poles and utilize them for construction. They're incredible construction material for on-site here. We don't have a timber harvest plan. We're not selling lumber or non-merchantable timber is what we're dealing with here. So this is not a commercial operation. And we have done prescribed fire here since the late 90s. This was our first controlled burn back in 97. And we burned iteratively, primarily in grassland and a little bit in chaparral. And we do have a burn permit pending right now to do a 4.5 acre understory burn in an oak woodland system that we've prepped, and the fog shut us down last Friday, but we're going to get it done. We have breeding northern spotted owl on this property, the endangered species. And you know what? We didn't have spotted owl breeding here when we first moved here. I'm a spotted owl biologist, a marble mirror biologist. This is what I do. I'm an ornithologist. And I know we didn't have them. And we had our first entry in an area back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we limbed and thinned 10 acres back there. And we opened up those what were called dog hair thickets that were impenetrable to everybody. Deer couldn't move through them, people couldn't move through them, and owls couldn't fly through them and hunt anything in them. And in the process of limbing, thinning, opening up that material, fewer trees, more forest, reutilizing the biomass and creating space, what we witnessed is that basically 8 years ago, a pair took up residence here, and we produced 2 baby spotted owls out of that nest for the last 7 years in a row. And the primary place, once the owls have fledged, that we see them go and set up shop and wait for their parents to bring them a wood rat to eat, which we've witnessed many times, is in these areas that we opened up and we limbed and we thinned on behalf of fuel load. And the carbon went to water and went to carbon cycles, but we're also actually thinning to create spotted owl habitat. We're weird at OAC. We love the endangered species, and we're creating habitat for them on our property by design and intention. And wood rats, you want to be weird? We're actually creating wood rat habitat in that beyond the 100-foot zone. In the backcountry, dusky-footed wood rat for us here is the dominant prey base for the northern spotted owl. Sonoma tree voles are also a prey base for them. And also Steller's jays. I found a lot of Steller's jay feathers and spotted owl pellets, to be honest with you. So we use a lot of biomass and strategically pilot in certain ways to create wood rat habitat nests, which is, we think is really fun. So here's a project where back in 2000, we were working with what was then called the Marin Conservation Corps. It's now North Bay Conservation Corps, in an area, and you can see that oak tree. There's 4 little trunks of an oak tree, and all around it is just an overstocked, dense Douglas fir thicket. So we got in there with a crew of these youth, limbed it, we thinned it, we opened it up, and then we took all that material because it happened to be in an area where there was a really significant gully, like 6 feet wide and 5 feet deep and 50 feet long, that had been dumping raw sediment into the stream below and resulting in the delivery of sediment to Dutchbill Creek down below, where the steelhead and the coho spawn. And sediment is the single largest pollutant and most important impact on the spawning and rearing of our endangered fish downstream. So we took that material, thinned it. You could see the same oak tree in the center there, the cluster of 4 trunks, and we placed it in an arrangement like a beaver dam. We're upland beavers. We don't have real beavers here, so we get to just embody our bipedal beavers. And we place this material structurally in a way that allows that flow of water to hit that, be biofiltered, slow down, drop out sediment, sequester sediment in situ for storage, and then break down. So we are getting sediment sequestration, groundwater recharge, upland gully stabilization, carbon sequestration, clean water out on behalf of salmon in a system that is more fire resilient and sequestering carbon. And we get to do it with youth who are on the job training. I'm a herpetologist as well. And so I think a lot about the leaf litter life and the understory and the small leaf litter of the detritus and the leaves and the breaking down organic matter. And so to be honest with you, for us as a small landholder in a non-timber based scenario, we only do handwork in our forest. And it's chainsaws and some loppers and some pole saws and things of that nature. We're not running masticators here. in the forest. We're trying to optimize and maintain the integrity of the leaf litter on behalf of the 4 species of lungless salamanders that we all have here at OAC, or on behalf of our incredible mycorrhizal fungi communities, because I'm also love to go out and mushroom and forage for chanterelles and black chanterelles and king boletes, and that the myceliated rhizome layer in that leaf litter is really critical, as well as the water holding capacity. And I'm also super geeked out on these little native endemic spiders that are called turret spiders that build these little turrets. I think they're ought to be called a snorkel spider, because what that is it's a snorkel that sits above the surface. So when we get that atmospheric river rain event like we just had in October, where we got 20 inches at OAC in 5 days, that sheet flow doesn't go down in their silken burrow. And there are these amazing spiders that are endemic, and they're indicators of a certain stage of succession where the leaf litter community has integrity and hasn't been completely squished and smushed and had a Cuisinart run over the top of it and turned it into bare dirt. And so these again are totem indicator species that support our management strategies and tactics and practices to unfold. We have lots of invasive broom on this site. We have both French and Scotch broom. And so at times of year when the seeds on the broom are not, there are no seeds on the broom, which is either now, to be honest with you, all the way through until kind of early spring, we will lop it. We're going to cut it. We're going to pull it with weed wrenches. We're going to remove it from where it's invading in the grasslands and the chaparral. And then we're going to use that material for an incredible gully stuffing. It's a gully food, and we'll place it in a head cut like this one in the photo here. Again, there's a strategic way to do that. This next year, we'll ideally be offering some tours to the community. Maybe we'll get some half-day DIY hands-on trainings. Although the timing around when we're allowed to gully stuff is a little bit complicated. But our goal here really is, whether it's with excess native biomass from Douglas fir or redwood that we're limbing and thinning, or French and Scotch broom, we want to use the biomass to mitigate the head cut migration and while we reduce that incision of the channel, which then reduces the sediment delivery to the coho and steelhead downstream, while we're using that material that was a problematic fuel load in its orientation that was connecting ground to crown, by thinning it and thus reducing the fuel load, we're placing it in a gully so we can sequester carbon in a form of compost, which is greenhouse gas emission reduction in situ, and that enhances the forest resiliency and amplifies the upland water holding capacity, because we're raising the bed elevation of the gullies, which then reduce the dewatering of the hill slope hydrology and increase the optimization of the sponge for recharge to ultimately support the possibility of beneficial flows to coho downstream over time. Yep, we got permits to stuff them gullies. So we actually here this fall, we applied for a permit from the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board and one from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. You can see the 2 permits are here, and on the map on the left, all the little places in yellow, or the little stars, are different types of treatments that we have spec'd out that we ultimately intend to utilize the limbing and the thinning materials from the 41 acres we're doing on the property right now, which I'm going to show you a map for. And we're strategically intending, on behalf of watershed health and water quality and quantity and salmonid recovery and carbon sequestration, are restoring the legacy gullies that are the result of the historic hydrologic derangement from clear-cut logging and road systems, and reusing that problem as part of a solution. And so again, more placement strategically, and we're an education center, so we have a lot of opportunity where many hands make light work. And this, if it'll run for us, is just a time lapse of a gully that you can see dead center. There's about a 4-foot head cut, about 8 feet wide, with another one above. And we did some limbing with folks. And so we're on the hill slope, limbing and thinning and reducing fuel load and disconnecting fuel load. And they were strategically placing that material. We laid the fine material down as a gauze bandage so that we don't get any erosion underneath the structure or on the sides of the structure. And then we laced it with large carbon and big logs and big wood. And we're making a hugelkultur that ultimately, processes that I've done here like that for over 25 years now, will eventually they will fill in, they will lock up, they will bring the channel bed up, and we'll get the channel running up on the surface as it used to be before time of contact and logging once again. And so it's super fun. And I just want to give a shout out to a good friend of mine, Kyle Keegan, and his brother, Evan Walbridge, and the folks at Sanctuary Forest. And this is a link to a really wonderful booklet they wrote about land stewardship. And so these are just a couple photos of a gully system that he had in a meadow, where if you don't have as much material like the gullies I showed you, I'm in an upland system, what's called an order 1, a class 3. It's no perennial water there. There's no fish there. There's not even amphibians there or aquatic invertebrates there. It's an only runs when it rains kind of a system, right? Similar to here. But if you don't have enough material to completely fill the gully in the parallel drainage, you can do things like this, which is where he used limited amounts of material, but strategically placed it perpendicular to the gully and across the channel with a bit of a U shape. And then, as you can see, the photos, you're actually looking down the gully. The drawing on the left is a view looking the opposite direction of how that material is placed. And look at the amount, the volume. There's many feet of sediment that are now stored behind that system. And then eventually you can continue to fill this in, raise the gully back up, and then revegetate it to hold that soil in place for all the good reasons. So we did participate with the North Bay Forest Improvement Program right now. Thank you, Goldridge RCD, and After the Fire, formerly Rebuild North Bay. We applied to do timber stand improvement with historical woodland enhancement and some light understory removal and ladder fuel reduction with various follow-up / beneficial biomass practices. And we are underway doing that work right now. And we bought $10,000 worth of tools that all burned up in our barn fire, for the people who know that we lost our barn some years ago, or in March of 2020. And then we've been working with entities like Sonoma College, our Santa Rosa Junior College here, and getting folks out. And we have permaculture students that work in the forest, and we're working with Circuit Rider and engaging many people in our own crew to limb and thin and work on ecological restoration and regeneration, both of the forest and of the, not just the ecosystem, but we're also interested in restoration of the ecosystem. We're doing ecosystem restoration because this is about community coming together to do the work. One of our critical partners, again, that Lindsay Daly, former staff here, is director, project manager of, is called the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance. And this is, as you can see, from Robinson Rancheria and Scotts Valley Rancheria. They're 2 bands of Pomo tribes in the Lake County area that have a whole work crew that's all native and all indigenous Pomo work crew, and they're amazing. And then it's ultimately about collaboration and the collective work. And thank you to FireSafe Sonoma and FireSafe Occidental and FireSafe Sonoma and FireSafe Camp Meeker and all of the community efforts and the various nonprofits. This is a specific look at West County around that. It's going to take the whole of us, the emergent property, that the whole of all of us is going to be greater than the sum of the work that's needed to be done. And so that really moves us away from an image of like just the OAC rectangle that's on the right-hand side where it says Sewing Circle OAC, conceptually beginning to talk to our 2 neighbors to the west of us, and also talk to St. Dorothy's Rest to the north and Camp Meeker to the north, or the Ganellas who own to the west, and the folks to the south, and beginning to think about landscape scale shaded fuel bio buffers, where we're managing for all these benefits, but we're doing it at a landscape scale on behalf of mitigating the flammability of the system. And how does that then build even to a larger network? And this is some collaborative organizing that many of us have been doing, and you can see the properties of the Bohemian Corridor from Monte Rio, in this case, all the way down to Salmon Creek School, and looking at the parcels and the land ownership and connecting with each other and developing a collaborative, a community wildfire protection plan, a CWPP, and how do we implement that? Because at some point, history is something for us to deal with. And I really appreciate Noel Buck and Diane Musser and Bob Fink, who put this together for us at the watershed display by the watershed divide display in Occidental in front of Howard's. So go stare at this map, and I'm going to leave you with that while there's the history and the present, ultimately we're in for this on the long game of what's the future look like. And I'm interested in talking with you all in the Q&A about what's the future look like. And there you have it. I'm going to stop sharing.
Wow. Brock, I'm so glad you were able to be here with us today, because that's just all fascinating. And you know how much I like to geek out with you on this subject matter. And I'm sure everybody else was really delighted. And John Kanegi, are you here to hand out the questions? Because we have a number of questions that have been piling up in the Q&A. And
yes, Ellie, I am here. You can
Okay.
hear me?
yep.
I cannot get my video to go on, but if you can hear me, then I will curate some questions. We've got about 16 at this point, but I'm sure the rapt audience is still recovering from Brock's talk, and we'll get some additional questions in. So I'll try to divide these between the two speakers, suggest one or the other to respond, or both of them, as the case may be. I'll start with this first question that came in. It came in during Mike's talk, and so he might want a chance at it first. Kimberly writes, thanks for this presentation of ideas. Thinning may be a way to allow heat and drying. Very concerned about this. Beyond 100 feet seems questionable. Nature fire adapted, and we need long-term views. Ember may travel hundreds of feet, so thinning is logging that may not help this problem, but accelerate heating and drying. Mike, what do you think about that notion of shaded fuel breaks contributing too much to heating and drying of the understory?
I mean, there's a lot packed into those comments. Certainly, when you open up the overstory, you change the dynamics of light and growth and that happens in the surface fuels. I reject the notion that opening the canopy is bad, because when you have a mature closed canopy forest and you have a tree fall down, say you have an old growth redwood forest and an old growth redwood falls down, that thing is going to take out a huge swath of trees and create a very large opening and gap. And that light and that extra heat that gets down to the forest floor is what is crucial for regeneration. And so the idea that opening the canopy is just negative is, I think, is oversimplifies the complexities and the dynamic nature of these systems. And understory light is crucial for regeneration of not only the conifers, but the hardwoods. And so I think certainly when we're talking about thinning, I'm not promoting clear cutting. That we can all agree that's not a sustainable practice. But opening up the canopy a little bit is depending on your goals and objectives, not necessarily going to be a bad thing. And so, I mean, but at the end of the day, it depends on your goals and objectives. And if you want to manage closed canopy, go for it. But I think creating gaps and openings and changing that structure is pretty critical to create heterogeneity in the forest structure and the biodiversity that kind of accompanies that structural characteristics.
Thanks so much. Brock, here's a question that came in about the material laid on contours from Thea. The question is, how do you make sure that the material laid on contour intercepts the water rather than just running under it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we're say limbing and thinning like a trunk of a Doug fir, which we tend to take, the 2 to 3 to 4 inches. When we lay that on contour, we're going to take that extra step to kind of nuzzle it into the leaf litter a little bit. And so that we know that it's kind of nestled within that. It's not hung up and hanging up high. And we often will put them as a little bit of a ramp. So we might put 2 or 3 together, thinking that, or based on the observation that when water does come down the slope, it hits the face of this contour log. And if it builds up over time, it'll run over the top of it. And where you want to protect is the waterfall effect on the downside of that little log. So we'll have 2 or 3 of them that are smaller. So it's like a little ramp that then it slides off, and it just, as it builds up, the water will run off. And you get this amazing buildup. You know who really loads them up? All the quail, all the towhees, both spotted in California, the fox sparrows who get in there and scratch and scratch and scratch on a slope. If you've never paid attention to how much biomass and leaf litter rolls down hills over time from bird scratch alone and gravity. And so we're creating contour carbon catchments that become sponges that absorb and hold water and sequester carbon and the nutrients in that system. And we don't get sheet flow going underneath them.
Thank you. David wrote during Mike's presentation, but I think Brock may have some thoughts on this as well. He asks, how do we deal with the regrowth of California Bay post LNU fire, a highly flammable plant now reestablishing as a bush versus a tree on our mountain, which is Mount Baca?
Yeah, boy, the fact that so many of our hardwoods and redwood resprout is just a super complex challenge to thinking about forest management and restoration. Right, you go through and thin, and I'm sure Brock has lots of ideas that he can share, but it's tricky, it's challenging, and part of that management is using tools to kind of mitigate that regeneration, or to facilitate and support it in areas that you want. And I don't have great answers for how we manage that. There's the continuing in there with entries of hand thinning, using prescribed fire, grazing. There's lots of tools to achieve that, but the capacity and the potential for those plants to resprout is very strong, and disturbances like fire and thinning will trigger robust responses. So figuring out how to manage that is a challenge that we're all still trying to figure out. And I don't think there's any one right answer or one wrong way. I will say that, I don't like to blame individual species, just kind of a side note, that I don't like to blame individual species for how they burn, right? Because then we get into the narrative that, well, this plant, we don't want this plant on site because it burns more severely than other plants. I think it's important when we think about fire that it's the structure of the vegetation or the fuel that influences fire behavior. Certainly there are characteristics of the species, but as soon as we start targeting individual plants, we're gonna, unintentionally remove some of that biodiversity. So thinning bay in areas that maybe you're worried about the accumulation of biomass, letting them regenerate, letting the deer browse, all these different, no one approach works. And so I think, it's tricky and maybe it's definitely not an easy answer.
I'll just chime in there and say I fully concur with Mike that it's really complicated and it's not an easy answer. And having spent a bunch of time in some of the big catastrophic crown fire systems that are over in the East County there, whether it's bay or any, as I said, any of the hardwoods or redwood as well as a crown sprouting, stump sprouting species. And so, yeah, I think it's really at what scale you have the labor and the capacity to interface with those. If it's not lots of trees, there's something to look at for folks is just that there's a world of management of crown sprouting trees that's known as coppicing. And when you flush cut a tree or fire flush cuts the tree for you, that crown sprout comes up. And indigenous peoples all over the world, including California, intentionally did that to manage crown sprouts for material products or firewood or basketry materials and things of that nature. And I get it. If you've just got hundreds and hundreds of bay sprouts that look like little green bushes, that may not work for you. But if you've got smaller amounts of fat and they can live, you may choose to basically hand thin out and select the one or two stems that you're going to allow to become the future new trunk and try to manage that crown. And I'm absolutely clear that's really labor intensive.
Yeah, I just want to mention that Kim Batchelder from the Sonoma County Ag and Open Space District writes, at Calabasas Creek Open Space Preserve, we pruned bay resprouts, leaving 3 stems, excuse me, 3 stems-ish per stump to try to use shading to reduce resprouts along a shaded fuel break along the roads. So that's close to what you're saying, Brock. And it is very labor intensive. Thanks, Kim.
Okay, thanks. There's a couple of questions about the lop and scatter technique for dealing with slash. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Anya wrote, for lop and scatter, what is the maximum height that should be left behind for the biomass on the ground? And Chris also wrote, lop and scatter creates a high fire risk in the short term. Is there information available on how long before the scattered materials decay to a lower risk based on climate zones? And I have a feeling both of you may want to respond to this. Mike, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, right. So under prescription for EQIP or CFIP or within the forest practice rules, as Brock mentioned in his presentation, 18 inches is the depth that you're looking to achieve. And the length of the material varies, but EQIP is about 4 feet or less. As far as, and that's under contract, right? So how you conduct and achieve lop and scatter may be different, right? If Brock is going to slash pack, he may be leaving bigger pieces, or it may be different practice. And then, you know, this is a really interesting question about decay. And our original assumption, and not mine, the editorial we, if I will, was that, you know, if we lop and scatter pieces small enough, right? So first of all, lop and scatter and forest practice rules comes from this idea that if you leave big pieces of material, you can artificially create habitat for bark beetles, and then the bark beetles can infest your big trees, your healthy living trees. So the idea is to reduce that host material, that food for the bark beetles, but also to reduce fuel risk or fire risk. And by lopping it up, that, you know, theoretically under the right conditions, that decays and breaks down faster. And of course, that significantly depends on microclimate and all kinds of climate and weather factors. And I think what we're kind of recognizing is that under the climate conditions we have right now, is that lop and scatter, when you just leave the material in place after lop and scatter, is not breaking down as fast as we had hoped. And so there's a lot of sites where I saw lop and scatter done a decade or more ago, and the material was still very much intact, and we saw higher than expected fire behavior in those areas. And so it's very tricky to kind of predict the decay rate. And I don't know if that's necessarily a reliable solution in the future. And certainly without follow-up treatments such as prescribed burning or some kind of mastication or pile burning or manipulation of that fuel. But, you know, it is certainly an option when it's, from an economics perspective, it's one of the cheaper ways to manage the fuel. So it might be certainly an option in steeper slopes or areas where, you know, you're limited on funds.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think we strive to the degree we can optimize the rate of decomposition. We generally have a sense that the closer you can get that biomass into the contact with the ground, into the contact with the leaf litter, where the moisture, soil moisture during the rains and the mycelium and the action of decomposers can get at it. If it's going to be hastened, it's going to go faster that way than if it's hung up in the air and open and just sitting there as a dry tinder sticks and things. So that's one of the reasons in our case, because for better or worse, we have 11 class 3 sub drainages that drain off of OAC, and we're blessed, shall we say, with several thousand feet of these incised head cut gullies. So to me, I'm really interested in, instead of leaving a lot of that slash that's flammable on the surface, I'm trying to pack it in the gullies. And I'm sure that before everybody types in your question right now, yeah, those packed slash gullies, if we get a fire in those things really soon right now, it's not going to be ideal. It's a bit of a risk reward game, and we're attentive to that. And that's really why we're blending different sizes. But I can tell you, once we get a season or two of winter rains over them and water, and they settle in and they start composting and they break down and become humus, their flammability quotient in the gully drops off pretty quickly over a year or two, more quickly than it does if it's left lopped and scattered. So we're doing a mix of things and a blend, but we're striving not to have, like, I still would love to see the leaf litter in places and not have to be walking over a mountainous 18-inch thick piles when I'm lopping and scattering. That's too much biomass, I think, for us.
Brock, a follow-up question on your gully packing. Kim asked, did the big gully washers in October compromise any of your work?
Not a bit. It was like a catcher's mitt for all that flow and all that water and the way we set them up. So yes, as soon as that flow happens, the first flow, just like in stormwater management, it's called the first flush. Those creeks are loaded up with all seasons long dry leaves, needles, debris, detritus, and everything. And so the way we set the slash packing up is you pack it right up to the lip of the head cut and just a little below, and the shoulders are high, so you keep the center line of the channel right on top of your biomass, and then it floods on with the water all of the leaves and the debris and the detritus, and it just forms this incredible little compost delivery, mulch delivery system. And then that water is dispersed across the whole gully pack, and it filters in slowly. We take out the punch, the energy of the velocity and volume there, and we slowly are hydrating a compost pile because we've laid in brown and green material, and it just filters and slows, and then out the bottom comes clean water, slower and later.
Okay, thank you. Question for either or both of you. From Alvaro, before doing fuels treatments, are there any efforts to carry out botanical surveys to protect rare and endangered plants?
Yeah, I'll take maybe the kind of boring administrative response, and Brock might have some more interesting, insightful aspects to add. If you are doing the work under EQIP or CFIP, which are the cost share programs I mentioned, or the North Bay Forest Improvement Program, those require surveys. So because the funding mechanism is state funded, that requires essentially the equivalent of a CEQA type review of resources. The same goes for any other activities conducted under the forest practice rules, or if you get grant funding from a state agency, it requires CEQA. However, if you're doing work on your own or paying for a contractor to do the work, you are not required in most cases to conduct those surveys. And I will say too, if you're prescribed burning at this point, you're also not required to conduct those surveys. That being said, I still think if you're concerned about those things, certainly due diligence would be to try to get that, hire the professionals to get those surveys conducted. And that would be an important aspect of your management plan, is to identify sensitive habitat areas and species of concern that you want to try to manage differently than other areas. So yeah, it really depends on kind of your funding and the mechanism in which you're trying to achieve the work.
I would just say in my case, as a landowner and as a biologist botanist, I'm like, when you go look at our stewardship plan and you check out our plant list and our vertebrate species list, you're going to be like, oh, he's a Virgo, he likes lists. So yeah, we're hyper focused on nerding out on all the surveys of all species, from the fungus to the plants to the animals and the who's who in that system. And everything I'm doing, as I talked about, is attempting to optimize the carrying capacity for those species as I'm, quote, managing this so-called vegetation, which is really life. And so that's the ethic and the ethos I bring to this work, and I'm pretty focused on it. But as Mike said, and because we have gotten funding through EQIP, through NBFIP, through CAL FIRE, CFIP, we're well above and beyond that minimum threshold of doing that work, because we just believe that that's the right thing to be done anyway. But not everybody has that capacity. I get it, but yeah.
Thanks, Brock. I'll let you continue with this as well. There's a question, you mentioned biochar in your talk. There was a question from Kim about biochar, and I wondered if you had anything more to say, given that there's some interest in that.
Biochar is just is a form of pyrolysis. It's attempting to burn woody material where you're attempting to create a little bit more of a low oxygen, low temperature setting, so that the material you're burning results in more black charcoal versus white ash. And then that charcoal is the bio part of biochar, is that charcoal in different sizes and particles can be utilized as a soil amendment. And there's a lot of interesting science around the durability of charcoal and the benefits it provides to the soil food web, to water holding capacity, to creating microscopic interstitial niches in places where life hooks up and gets in there, and bacteria can live and fungus can live, and it's durable through time. And it's really based on, to be honest with you, the work of that made somewhat a bit famous, or brought to the attention of many people through the work of, read a book by Charles Mann called 1491 about the relook at the Americas at the year before Columbus got here, and the folks in the Amazon, and looking at these earths. They're called teja pretas, the black earths. And there's these incredible soils in a lowland, humid, hot tropical rainforest where everyone thinks there's no fertility held in the soil because it's leached away. And there's these persistent black carbon-laden soils down there, which I've actually been to the village called Teja Preta. I've felt this on the main stem of the Amazon. And that has kicked off a whole world of interest and conferences and biochar movements and things. And so to me, it's I'm a composter of organic matter primarily. I want to make biological compost for the most part, but I think in a portfolio with excess woody material, if you like to burn things, there are really cool ways to use that biochar. And if you ever try to buy it at a store, it's really expensive right now. So maybe that's one economic engine for people, is to make biochar with your limbing and thinning and sell it to folks to improve soil health and increase carbon sequestration as a way to improve plant health, to sequester greenhouse gas emissions in excess in the atmosphere through photosynthesis and put them back in the soil for life.
Yeah, just one more statement on that. You know, biochar, great. I think it's an awesome mechanism, and we need to study a lot more in forest natural resource settings. And if you want to do conservation pile burns and different ways of producing it, that's fine. But at the end of the day, I think if you want to produce good biochar, just reintroduce fire into the stand, right? There's no point in dragging the biomass out of the stand or piling it when you could just put it on the forest floor and then burn it and have the same kind of paralysis. So, you know, I like to think that, you know, we, instead of focusing specifically on producing biochar, we just reintroduce fire into the stand, and a happy accident and consequence of that is we produce biochar.
Pile on and say that absolutely, that's my greatest hope for the understory, woodland understory burn we're hopefully going to get to do here, is that I'm a little bit happy that it's cool, so that we do get what I call slash and smolder, that we're going to get a cool, slow moving burn that burns the material just enough to get it to black charcoal without taking it to white ash. And then we'll let the rain come on that site, and it'll fertilize for decades to come that material in situ on that stand. And so I'm with you on that mix. So it's fun that there's intensive biochar and there's extensive biochar. It's a gradation within a portfolio of options.
Great, thank you. Here's the next question. Maybe I'll invite Mike to answer first. From Janice: we've had a lot of fire here recently. Is there evidence of how Sonoma County's treated landscapes have reacted to fires? I am thinking of treated or managed forests in the Mill Creek area that I am aware of that suffered extreme fire and then post-fire clear-cut salvage logging. The land looks very devastated in aerial photos as shown in the Press Democrat.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, before the fires that started a few years ago, there was not a lot of active management of private lands outside of commercial property. And so we don't have a lot of good evidence in West County of how you know, good stewardship and sustainable management practices can influence fire behavior. We certainly have evidence from 2008 fires and you know, that lightning complex in areas in Mendocino and some areas of well, actually that was just Mendocino County. And we do see some of the benefits of how thinning and managing can influence fire behavior, and you know, whatever, math is hard, 10 plus, you know, 15 years, whatever it's been at this point. We see these amazing stands where these fires occurred that were managed as well. Regarding Mill Creek, it's a mixed bag. There weren't a lot of people who were managing. There were some folks who had just completed like EQIP programs, but there's still so much fuel on the forest floor that the fire behavior was still fairly significant. And so I think that's important to recognize, is that there's no 100% solution and answer to dealing with wildfire. It's we're promoting management practices to mitigate the effects and try to reduce, or hopefully reduce, the potential impact from wildfire and improve the resiliency and recovery capacity of the forest and the natural resources. And so my hope is that as we do more pre-fire management in the region, and we do experience more wildfires, we'll hopefully see those benefits and be able to learn from past practices and what works and what doesn't work in the area. And you know, like that example I showed from the glass fire, that was an example where they did thinning, and a lot of it was understory thinning, but they did remove a few big trees in those stands, and we followed up with sky fire. And I think that's a really classic example of, or a really solid example of, how management practices can have a huge influence on fire behavior and help improve the health of the system. So I'm hoping that we kind of, you know, it's a laboratory, right? And we don't really have all the answers yet. And so I'm hoping that, you know, as we progress, we do maybe get some opportunity to learn from our practices and do better in the future.
All right, the next question, it comes from Kyle. Hi, what are your thoughts? Both Mike and Brock, I see Brock would like to answer the question for sure, around the increased use of mastication on a landscape scale and the potential unintended consequences of soil compaction, the smothering of understory plant communities, etc.
I mean, I guess in my presentation, I offered some of our thoughts specifically with respect to how we're managing the land at our place, and our preference and focus on using hand labor and not masticating the stand that way. And so that's how we're working. And then I have empathy and compassion out there for folks who are facing much larger scale situations and things. But generally, when I look at stands that have been masticated significantly, on behalf of the salamanders and the turret spiders that I showed, and some of those other fungal resources and mycelium and such, it feels I find myself disconcerted at times. I'll say that.
I think there's, again, depends. It all depends. It depends on your goals and objectives. I think there's a place for it. There's situations where it's not going to work, where it's not appropriate. Other times where it's probably going to be a really valuable option that people have when they're trying to do a lot of field direction work in a large landscape that's accessible. I think it's a viable option. And you can certainly work with in the prescription that you develop in your management plan, or as you're implementing the field direction work, you can try to mitigate some of those impacts. And I've certainly seen a whole variety of ways that people have done mastication, where they've gone really intense and ground into the soil and really mixed in that mulch with the soil, whereas people have did a light touch and the masticator had never touched the forest floor, and it kind of left like a nice bed of mulch. And you can use equipment, smaller equipment, tracked equipment, rubber tired equipment to minimize soil compaction issues. But I would say that a lot of the mastication projects I've seen look really good, and in my opinion would have strong potential to recover quickly if there is any significant impact. And I don't think it's done correctly and in the right situations, it's going to be a serious long-term impact. But that is something that has to be considered, is that each entry, whether it's on foot or with equipment, has some kind of impact to the system that has to be mitigated, or the system will have to recover from. So that is an important aspect to consider.
Okay, thank you. This next question comes from Kaylin. It's a little bit more about sort of technical resources. Mike mentioned help from the RCDs as a resource to help with forest plans. From my experience, I know the bandwidth is limited. That is only one forester for the whole county. Does the panel have any ideas on how to increase the bandwidth of technical expertise locally so that more residents are able to make these plans for their properties?
Oh, boy, that's a great question. how far back in large and scale do we want to go right now? Education, right? It all starts with education. We need to get people excited about forest management and pursue a career. And in California, to practice forestry, you have to be a registered professional forester, which requires education or experience in taking a test. So getting people excited about forest management, helping them recognize that it's not just about silviculture and cutting trees, but that you can be a fisheries person and be a forester. You can be a wildlife biologist and be a forester, or soil scientist, or carbon scientist, whatever you want, or entomologist, and help them understand that, you know, you can specialize in different aspects and develop management plans that try to achieve those goals and objectives. And, you know, we're throwing a lot of money at this problem right now. And in my opinion, we got the cart in front of the horse, because we're trying to throw money at implementation. And we have a significant lack of capacity because we don't have the professional resources, nor do we have the infrastructure to actually achieve the work that we are trying to on the scale and the scope and scale that we would realistically like to achieve. And so, I mean, I think that my long-winded answer there is that you just need to get more people interested and excited about being in natural resource and forest management. And that starts with educational programs and encouraging, you know, local government and the schools to continue to fund and develop those kinds of programs.
I'll just build off of that, which I agree at some level is this the opportunity really at a societal level to have those folks that are qualified to do this work. And so whether it's at OAC, we've had a school garden teacher training program for ecological literacy for 25 years. It starts from kindergarten on up, and that's a whole piece of the puzzle for nature deficit disorder. And then with the funds that the Sonoma County via the Board of Supervisors received in part from some of the PG&E settlement funds from other fires, you know, they recently gave $500,000 to Santa Rosa Junior College, and under the direction of Brianna Boaz in the Natural Resource Management Department there, and with Fred Ufrat, who's known to many of us here, he's a West County forester and landowner. They are specifically focused at the JC level, at a voc tech scale, of engaging people in learning these skills to become professional resource managers. And hopefully out of the junior college, that's a classic feeder program that get them into a UC and work their way up so that they could become a registered professional forester or a registered, you know, rangeland manager, or whatever those credentials are needed. And so I think it's really we as a society thinking from kindergarten to college, what is it going to look like, and how are these professions exciting and interesting and part of the solution, and engaged and accessible and diversified. That's why I really appreciate the work of the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance, or North Bay Conservation Corps, or Sonoma Ecology Center's crews in bringing a diversity of people who are stepping into this work. Because we all are feeling the lack of foresters. Jason's amazing, love the guy, he's great, and there's way too much demand for him and too much need. And so, yeah, bring on more folks.
Thanks. A question a little bit more back down to the ground level. Martha asks or states that dead canes of blackberry are a fire hazard. However, they're also wildlife habitat. What season is best to bring down these dead canes and not disturb wildlife?
Brock, I'll defer to you on that one, but typically, you know, if you're worried about birds, you don't want a bird during nesting and brood season when they're using that habitat. And that's certainly something we think about with prescribed fires. You know, when are we burning in the spring, and when's the appropriate time to do that? But maybe Brock has a much more elaborate response to that question.
I would just say that, you know, under the permit conditions, for instance, that many of us have, the work window for fuel load and limbing and thinning work in the forest is between February 1st and August 31st. We're not working in the woods on behalf of breeding bird season protection. So when we're managing Himalayan blackberry patches and thickets, and I totally agree, Diane, that they're really important wildlife habitat. We kind of have a rotational grazing relationship with blackberries, and we might thin a stand in the late fall and summer after the breeding birds aren't there, and cut some down and maybe put it to the side and pile burn it or compost it. As you well know, unless you're digging the crowns, it's going to be right back and green and healthy, and you'll have plenty of blackberry pies that next summer because it's so rambunctious. So we don't really like clear cut all our stands all at once. We kind of have iterative interactions, so we retain some of that complexity and wildlife cover habitat in the blackberry stands, and we also are managing it and moving some out simultaneously.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, John, it's I think we've reached the end of our designated 6 to 8 time, and we haven't. The questions are coming in just as fast as they're getting answered, which is really a sign that people are very engaged. I'm wondering if we can just preserve these questions that haven't been answered, and maybe see if we can.
That's a great idea, Ellie. We could do something in a Q&A format in the Safer West County newsletter to take these questions, and then have Mike and Brock and you sort of look them over and put some of those answers out, and we could email them to the participants tonight as well.
Yeah, how do you feel about that, Brock and Mike? Do you want to
I mean, a lot of them got answered, but I think there's still some stuff we could summarize for people.
Are you guys available to look some of these over, and maybe we can do a little wrap up and via email to the folks that were registered?
Sure, yeah, we'll just have like a little advice columnist little moment in the newsletter there. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Ask Brock.
Yeah, right. I'll ask Mike and Brock. Amy, do you want to do the wrap up? One thing I'll just say is that we will send out an email afterwards with a recording and a set of resources, a link to the resources, or I'm sorry, Safer West County rules. So Amy, I'll just hand that over to you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, we will definitely send the recording and the resources that have been so generously shared by all of the presenters. And I just want to thank Brock and Mike and you, Ellie, and everybody else who's participated, all the people who are on the call, who've asked questions and listened. And it's really, really inspiring to have such an engaged community. And Safer West County is very grateful for all of your participations, as well as everybody that's starting to join us and grow the community as a networked group of people trying to do our best at stewarding this beautiful land. So yeah, thank you very much, Brock. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Fire Safe Sonoma, for helping us do this. Yeah, we're very blessed to be part of this community, and we'll send everything out as soon as it's the recording sent to us. So you'll have it soon.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. And Brock and Mike, I'll send you a list of questions, or maybe John, you could do that. You've got probably better access to the Q&A and the chat. Thanks. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a great night, everybody.
Right. Night, everyone. Thank you.